Steve. Good morning, everybody. Jared, we're here today to talk about social impact, purpose, how to get the equation right. And I'm sort of aware of this time when we're at conferences like this, we talk a lot about public-private partnerships. I'm interested in how you see the terrain when the public part of this seems to be defecting from supporting so many things, that when you look at the government's role, particularly the federal government's role in band-aiding and patching so many of the deficits we have out there, there seems to be a retreat. So how do you make public-private partnerships work in this age?
Well, we see them, it's a general term, so it certainly means everything from, a social impact bond to toll roads. And in an era of difficulty finding the budget on the public side, right, jurisdictions, states, local governments, federal government are thinking more creatively about how they can leverage private relationships for the public good or for a public purpose. What you generally talk about there is then, the metrics. A typical example would, of course, be something we use in Colorado, which are toll roads, where effectively, because we're unable to have bonds to do a lot of our infrastructure, we form public-private partnerships to front the money for toll roads with the toll-taking authority. Usually the jurisdiction would negotiate for, a car with 2 passengers or 3 passengers to be free in that kind of lane, a high-density vehicle lane. So, but no, I think you're right. I mean, it's kind of interesting what's happening politically, because at the same time, the public side is sort of shrinking back. There's also increased skepticism on the left about the public-private partnership piece. So what this could potentially lead to is less public infrastructure on both the social and capital side altogether.
I know you're a champion of social impact bonds, and I have to admit I have tried to read everything I can on them. I still don't quite get how they work. So if you imagine me being, I don't know, Chuck Grassley in the Senate, you're trying to give me a 30-second version and sell me on this. How do you describe the nut of what social impact bonds are?
Well, basically, it's a pay-for-performance mechanism. So instead of asking taxpayers to give the government a blank check, you're basically saying, you know what, we found an investment that we've demonstrated is accretive. Like, let's invest in early childhood education for at-risk kids. We know the studies show this reduces special education rates. That saves money for school districts. It reduces grade repetition rate, saves money for school districts, reduces youth adjudication rate, saves money for the justice system. So we want to find an investor set to advance the money to provide the quality preschool or program for 3-year-olds, and they would get repaid based on the metrics of what they're saving the different jurisdictions later on. If those savings don't materialize, the investor money is at risk. The kids still got the preschool, but the investors either get penalized or don't get paid. So the investors themselves would be very interested in the program design, making sure that it's set up in such a way that the savings will actually accrue to the public sector so they can be repaid.
When I hear about bonds, whether it's infrastructure bonds or social impact bonds, I'm aware that we just passed the tax bill. The House passed the tax bill, the Senate passed the tax bill, and I'd just love to get your sense of what we should be thrilled about in those tax bills and what we should be alarmed by.
Well, there's not a lot to be thrilled about from my perspective, Steve. I think, unfortunately, there's both the content and the process. From a process perspective, it was obviously frustrating for me as a Democrat to have all of our amendments blocked out, even the bipartisan, relatively non-controversial ones. From a content perspective, this really will lead to an even greater underinvestment in human capital. It hits education the hardest, both higher ed as well as K-12. In terms of the positive side, obviously ever since I've been in Congress, we've been very interested in doing tax reform on the corporate side. President Obama had proposed that as well, bringing down the corporate tax rate to around 25 to 28% had been the range we're talking about. So, again, I think corporate tax reform is overdue, but not on the backs of colleges and K-12 schools in this country.
Which I know that's a major pillar for you. I know you're running for governor in Colorado as well, and one of the provisions you've talked a little bit about is, universal preschool and kindergarten, making that available to everyone, and other provisions. So as you do that, what is the deficit out there? Why isn't that the case now?
Yeah. And real quickly, for those who don't follow it as closely on the tax side, some of the provisions that are harmful to schools are interest on student loan, no longer deductible, graduate tuition, no longer deductible. One key one, employer contributions to tuition, no longer deductible with a tax credit. So I mean, that's like your Starbucks of the world that help pay for their baristas to go to college would either no longer do it at all under this tax bill, or would have to have the amount they do it by for the same economic effect for them. And then, of course, even classroom teachers can't deduct the $250
Have
they spend on
they reacted
supplies.
to that yet? I mean, I know that Howard Schultz was celebrating this opportunity to take people, give people that were working for him an opportunity to go.
Yeah, they're one of the big employers that have taken advantage of this provision, and again, that's one of the things that struck down under this. So it'll make it much less incentive and reduce the number of employers that actually help pay for their workers to attend college.
You know, one of the things we've been thinking about in the Atlantic and many of our programs that it sort of comes up is that there's a kind of collapse of trust in institutions, trust in Congress and politicians, trust in businesses. And it's one of the reasons why we're discussing today, you know, businesses with purpose, businesses that have social impact, and a kind of diminishment of empathy. And as someone who's elected and feels these tensions yourself, how do you, when you talk to constituents, how do you get them reconnected and hopeful?
Well, you know, I think that if there's any silver lining to the governance issues that the country has had, the skepticism of the Trump administration, is it has reinvigorated civic discourse and civic engagement and involvement. I mean, when you see, you know, millions of people at the Million Woman March or the March for Science, I see, you know, 16-year-olds, you know, dragging their grandmother in tow, and you know, and the grandmother saying, "I haven't done this since the '70s," and it's their 16-year-old granddaughter that's taking them. And so, this kind of engagement and involvement is a very hopeful thing, a very positive thing. It's exciting to see, and I just hope that it contains and continues and build its momentum.
I know you're also one of your pillars in running in the state for governor is trying to promote more employee ownership of companies. And how do you do that? We were just talking backstage about Hamdi Gulakaya, who's the CEO of Chobani. And for those of you who don't know, Hamdi was a Kurdish-Turkish refugee, came into America, took over a old, I think it was a cottage cheese plant in upstate New York. You know, then that's Chobani, and now he's in Idaho. He's all over the place. And he wanted to give 10% of his company to his employees, and he did do it. But it wasn't an easy thing to do, and it was unusual enough. I had a lot of coverage from it, but it's not something you see often. So how do you, in your role, go out and actually try and get companies to do right by their employees?
This is one of the things that I'm most excited about, how we can have a more inclusive form of capitalism, and certainly multi-stakeholder capitalism and B Corps are part of that. Another part of that is to talk about and facilitate employee ownership in all of its forms, and employee participation and profit. So this runs the gamut from stock options to equity grants to co-ops to ESOPs to formalized profit-sharing agreements. Really all of the above. And what can be done on the public side is several-fold. We can streamline and facilitate the law to make these things easier. Some of them have real tax implications that we need to do something about. I've had a bill, for instance, with bipartisan bill Dana Rohrabacher to make small equity grants to employees tax-free, sort of making them more analogous to options so that companies can actually compensate with equity instead of options. They're both fine mechanisms, but better to use equity if you could. In the companies I've started, we've had universal stock options in companies like ProFlowers and American Information Systems, where every employee receives stock options, even administrative level employees, people that are picking up phones, people in sales. So every employee, it's not just the management. We want to make sure we create a system where it's not just the executives and the shareholders that do well, but every employee does well when the company succeeds. Symbolically, I kicked off my campaign for governor in Colorado at a 100% employee-owned grocery store called Save-A-Lot Grocery Store in Colorado Springs. So it's owned by the butcher and the bagger and the cashier. And they have, I think, 11 grocery stores in our state. And people who have worked there for 8 years, 10 years as cashiers because the company has succeeded over time, now have a solid equity stake in that company. Now that's above and beyond their retirement 401k. They also have hundreds of thousands of dollars of equity in the grocery store that they work at. So we need to find different ways by reducing red tape, reducing the legal and accounting fees, to transitioning to employee ownership models, and building more of a cultural norm of employee participation and ownership.
You know, it's interesting. You've started. You mentioned Pro Flowers, which I'm fascinated that you founded and started this company, and that you've had other companies. You've been a very active, high-profile member of Congress. Now you're running for governor of Colorado. You're not quite there yet, but of these, where do you think you have the most impact?
Well, you mean in which capacity?
In which capacity?
Well, you know, there's good days and there's
We're
bad
talking about
days.
social
Steve.
impact today. I'm interested. Do House members make a difference? Can they make a difference?
We do. I've
as
really,
much as what
yeah.
you've done with Pro Flowers.
I've enjoyed. You know, it'll be 9 years for me in the House, and I'm honored to be the ranking Democrat on the early childhood and kindergarten through 12th grade subcommittee. And education's been a lot of my life work. I'd been on the chair of the State Board of Education before that, and started some charter schools. Actually, starting some of the schools, the nonprofit charter schools I started that serve at-risk youth, makes a huge difference to the thousands of young people that they've served in Colorado and New Mexico. But no, you know, being a House member is very exciting, and if it wasn't for this opportunity, you know, to run for governor, and I think do even more in Colorado, I'd probably be running for House again.
Interesting. I've been thinking a lot about today's forum and bringing. We did a forum on purpose the other day in New York, and Daniel Lubetsky, the CEO of Kind Bars. I don't know if you run across Daniel before, but he, you know, he's a food entrepreneur and a snack bar entrepreneur, but he's out in promoting kindness. And I've wondered in this world of social impact whether what was more important, the mission of trying to promote a different way of looking at each other and building empathy and mutual concern, or having a really good tasting snack. And he told me that, you know, you can't have one without the other. But I'm wondering, as you look at this field and social impact bonds, is there a danger of moving away from the core need as we're trying to solve problems? Like we become more about the problem than necessarily making the economic equation work?
Well, you have to have the value proposition. You have to have the demonstration. I think what you might be getting at is not every return is tangible. Certainly, tangible returns exist. Tangible returns are important. But it's certainly a fair point that there's always going to be some things that are difficult or impossible to measure that we as a society value. How do you measure whether, for instance, our schools are preparing students to be capable stewards of our country and of sound governance and civic participation? That's one of the challenges we always face in the education side, where we do, as you know, there's the standardized testing in kind of math and reading and in the different content areas. But we all know that those aren't the only things that we hope our schools to do. What about enrichment and art, and what about you know, civic knowledge? So there's a lot of things that are not tested for that are also important. That's not to understate. Of course, all kids need to be able to read, and of course, we need to get these results that are tangible. But you're right. There's a lot more, and you know, we can't reduce the simple equation of government to a you know, return on investment criteria.
Before I go to all of you for a question, just one last question. I know you're the flower guy. Governor Hickenlooper is the beer guy. When you look at his tenure in Colorado, what didn't he get done that you feel you could get done?
John's been a great governor for our state. He's nearing on the eighth year now. He's term limited. He can't run again. I think he leaves some of the challenges we have to the next governor. I think he's certainly done a lot of great work. But if you look at kind of how we're going to build our 21st century infrastructure to get ahead of the curve and deal with a lot of issues related to growth, that'll likely fall to the next governor. My platform in education is bringing universal preschool and kindergarten to the whole state. Certainly open to the public-private partnership side, but obviously also looking at the public funding side. All we have in our state is half-day kindergarten. Washington, D.C. is much further along in that regard, and all the studies show those are the most important years in terms of if you ever want to address the achievement gap and make a meaningful impact on poverty and differentials in education based on geography, race, income levels. So a lot of work to be done. Our state's in good fiscal condition, and I'm really excited to hopefully pick up the gauntlet and continue with some of the progress that's been made.
Interesting, thank you. Let me open the floor to questions, comments. Yes. Hey, hi.
Good morning. Thank you so much for coming out, Representative Polis.
And tell us who you are.
Here I work with the General Assembly.
Sure.
I want to know, from your perspective, obviously government can drive a huge impact on people's lives, but how do you see non-traditional businesses drive social impact in ways that people might not expect. If you have examples that you've seen in Colorado or examples that you would like to highlight, we're really curious as to how you've seen businesses drive social impact through non-traditional ways, whether it's not necessarily just investing in maybe mentoring.
Right. Thank you. And I don't think that mic is working, so we need to get that fixed.
Well, I think if I understand the question, I mean, frankly, you guys are an example. General Assembly, Galvanize, kind of this deconstruction of what higher education means, and this movement to kind of a boot camp skills model, which is more aligned to the needs of the workforce than the legacy, four-year degree system. So that's an exciting model that's happening today. It's largely happening despite government policy rather than because of it. What I've been championing the last few years is trying to find ways to open up our federal student loan and Pell Grant programs for these alternative models, while, of course, from the public interest side, having in place accountability and metrics so that they're not abused. But I think certainly in terms of metrics and return, job placement, what jobs and salaries people are getting out of these programs, and if you look at a lot of the high quality ones, certainly like General Assembly and Galvanize and others, you'll see that in many cases they have a higher success rate than especially some of the liberal arts majors at our four-year institutions of higher education. So I'm very excited about those kinds of disruptive models, and we should stop holding them back and kind of find a way to work with them to make sure that lower income families have access to these kinds of programs.
Great. Other questions come? Yes, right. Shelley Porges. We're going to bring you a microphone that works.
Thank you. Hi, Shelley Porges here in Washington, D.C., working on entrepreneurship and innovation around the world. I'm interested in the capital allocations and the lack of capital, most notably around the country, for so many of these, not only educational initiatives, but so many other social impact initiatives. Can you comment on that?
Just a general lack of capital around human capital? Yeah, social, but yeah, well, there is. I think, it's kind of a new area. I don't think you see mainstream investment capital in play. You see sort of pilot level capital and pseudo public interest capital and foundation capital. I think it has to be demonstrated and borne out before the markets kind of open up to have the scalable flow of capital that would really make a difference. And so, again, you have to show models where investors did get returns, it worked. That type of thing over time will increase confidence level. There's an enormous amount of capital out there, and if you can show a return, you can get it. So it's simply a matter of building the track record.
Aren't some of the large
models.
Foundations like Rockefeller and others
Yes.
engaged in this and trying to show, in fact, that those returns work?
Exactly, and so that's where it's basically limited to at this point. I mean, we think of them as huge foundations, they are, but in the overall investment world, they're small fish compared to all the capital that's out there. So that is where the capital is from today. It's from generally institutional, kind of forward-looking money that's interested in the concept, improving the concept, rather than just the return. What'll have to happen to get it kind of opened up to complete scalability will be we have to demonstrate that, yes, you can actually achieve market rate returns in these type of vehicles.
Right. Other question? Yes.
Bill Cunningham, Creative Investment Research. Thanks for coming out. Great event. I'd like to drill down on you said you had a bill to encourage stock grants. Before we do that, though, I'd like to get your opinion also. I just spoke at the Blockchain for Social Impact Conference in New York. So I'm interested in your opinion on blockchain, some of these technologies that are being used to drive social impact, and the cryptocurrencies.
Well, it's pretty, we could have a whole forum on that.
Yeah.
Among my other hats, I also co-chair the Blockchain Caucus, the Bipartisan Blockchain Caucus in Congress. So employee ownership, and what we're talking about is essentially trying to change some of the tax law so that there's not a tax implication when you are distributing ownership to employees as a benefit. And what blockchain will enable, and to a certain extent is enabling, but largely will, it'll reduce the transaction costs significantly for having large amounts of owners and distributing additional stock. So that is one impediment. I would rank tax as the biggest impediment, but transaction costs would be kind of probably a distant second in terms of impediments to why more employers don't directly distribute equity to employees today. and that's one that blockchain will absolutely help address.
One part of blockchain is blockchain, the other part is Bitcoin, and I saw on your Twitter feed, you have a great Twitter feed, that you took Joe Stiglitz on to task for a little bit.
Well, yeah. Look, I mean, you know, he
Joseph
kind of
Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winning economist.
Yeah, I don't know if he was necessarily acting as an economist, but he was sort of he said it should be banned and there's no value there, just sort of that kind of stuff. Whether it's a bubble or not, you know, I think I indicate he's perfectly welcome to bet on. He should, if he wants to make a fortune, he could short Bitcoin if he really is so confident it's a bubble. But in the meantime, his speculation is no more valid than anybody else's. Obviously, there is underlying value to the blockchain. I hope he recognizes that. We talked about one potential value in terms of distributed ledger for equity and for shareholders. There's no question. Separately speaking, is Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency overvalued? That may very well be, but that's a matter for markets to determine. You know, there's a lot of speculation, I'm sure, on both sides of that. But the underlying technology is here to stay. There's great ramifications across data-intensive areas, including public governance areas. You know, I'm pretty excited by the way that that's developing, and we have to make sure we have a thoughtful, not an overreactive reaction from the public side.
Well, Congressman Polis, as you struggle with these things, run for governor, think about ways to approach education and other forms of social impact, I hope you will come back and talk to The Atlantic many more times. So with
Always
that, thank
happy
you
to.
so much,
Thank you.
Jared.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.